In the spring of 1889, a wooden crate arrived at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. It had been shipped from a courthouse in Harlan County, Kentucky, deep in the Appalachian Mountains. Inside, wrapped in moth-eaten cloth, lay 73 glass plate photographs, the entire surviving archive of itinerant photographer Samuel Marsh, who had disappeared from the mountain settlements 22 years earlier. Among these images of miners, preachers, and stern-faced families arranged before cabin walls, one photograph stood out. It showed a woman in a dark dress, seated with 2 children at her sides. The composition was ordinary. What was not ordinary was the shadow cast against the cabin wall behind her. A 4th figure, taller than any person in the frame, its outline sharp and unmistakable. But there were only 3 people in the photograph. The Smithsonian cataloged the image as Marsh Collection, Plate 41, Unidentified Family, circa 1867. For 3 months it sat in storage. Then a young archivist named Daniel Cortland noticed the shadow. He brought it to his supervisor. Within a week, the photograph had been examined by 4 separate experts. Each reached the same conclusion. The shadow could not be explained by any object, person, or light source visible in the frame. The angle was wrong. The proportions were wrong. And the shadow showed details, the suggestion of a hand, the curve of shoulders, that matched no one present when the shutter opened. The Smithsonian launched a quiet investigation. They traced the photograph back through estate sales, county records, and forgotten legal disputes, searching for the woman, the children, and the story behind the image. What they uncovered was not a ghost story. It was something far more disturbing, a chronicle of survival, obsession, and the terrible weight of what people do to endure in places where law and mercy have no jurisdiction. This is that story, and it begins not with the photograph, but with the land that produced it. The Appalachian Mountains in 1867 were a world unto themselves. Stretching from Georgia to Pennsylvania, the range formed a natural barrier that had, for generations, isolated entire communities from the rest of the United States. In the eastern valleys, towns grew around textile mills and tobacco farms. But higher up, in the ridges and hollows of eastern Kentucky and western Virginia, families lived as their ancestors had, farming thin soil, hunting deer and wild turkey, building cabins from chestnut and oak, and surviving winters that could bury a settlement for months beneath snow and silence. These were not lawless places, but neither were they governed by institutions most Americans would recognize. There were no sheriffs for 50 miles, no courts that met more than twice a year. Justice, when it came, arrived through family networks, church elders, or men with rifles who claimed authority through force rather than ballot. In such places, a man's word was his bond, and a woman's reputation could determine whether her children ate or starved. People trusted blood, they trusted kin, and they trusted very little else. Into this world, in the summer of 1866, came Samuel Marsh. He was 31 years old, a veteran of the Union Army, trained in the relatively new art of wet plate photography during his service documenting battlefields and military hospitals. After the war, he purchased a wagon, a portable darkroom, and a set of glass plates, and began traveling the back roads of Kentucky and Tennessee, offering to photograph families for $2 per image, a steep price, but one that promised permanence. For people whose lives left little record, a photograph was a kind of immortality. Marsh kept meticulous journals. In them, he described the families he met, the distances he traveled, the meals he was offered, and the cabins where he slept when winter made the roads impassable. His entries were factual, almost clinical, filled with observations about light, exposure times, and the chemistry of developing plates in cold water. But occasionally, between descriptions of technical failures and successful portraits, he wrote about the people themselves. And in the autumn of 1867, he wrote about a woman named Eleanor Talmadge. She lived in a hollow near the Virginia-Kentucky border, a place so remote it appeared on no map. The nearest settlement, a cluster of 3 cabins and a general store, was 8 miles away through forest so dense that even in daylight, the canopy blocked the sun. Eleanor's cabin sat at the end of a narrow trail, beside a creek that ran cold and clear even in summer. She lived there with her 2 children, a boy of 7 and a girl of 5, and, according to Marsh's journal, no husband. When he asked about the children's father, Eleanor said only that he had gone to work in the coal camps 2 years earlier and never returned. She did not seem surprised. Men disappeared in the mountains. The land took them, or the mines did, or they simply walked into the woods one morning and were never seen again. Marsh photographed the family on a cool October afternoon. He set up his camera in front of the cabin, positioning Eleanor in a wooden chair with the children standing on either side of her. The light was good, soft and even, filtering through the trees. He exposed the plate for 11 seconds, a standard duration for outdoor portraiture in that era. Then he developed the image in his portable darkroom, a canvas tent he erected beside his wagon. When the plate dried, he examined it by lantern light. The composition was clean, the faces were sharp, and behind Eleanor, cast against the rough-hewn logs of the cabin wall, was a shadow that should not have existed. Marsh wrote about it that night. His entry, dated October 14, 1867, read, "Developed the Talmadge portrait this evening. Fine clarity, good exposure. But there is a shadow on the cabin wall, tall, distinct, positioned behind the woman as if someone stood just outside the frame. I was alone with the family. No one else was present. I have examined the plate 4 times. The shadow remains. I do not understand it. Tomorrow I will ask Mrs. Talmadge if she noticed anything unusual during the sitting." But Marsh never got the chance to ask. The next morning, when he returned to the cabin to deliver the finished photograph, he found the door open and the interior ransacked. Furniture overturned, clothes scattered, a pot of stew still warm on the stove. Eleanor and her children were gone. Marsh searched the surrounding woods for 2 days. He asked at the general store, spoke to a pastor who rode circuit through the hollows, and even walked as far as the nearest coal camp, showing Eleanor's photograph to miners who barely glanced at it before shaking their heads. No one had seen her. No one knew where she had gone. And no one, it seemed, was particularly surprised. Women disappeared too. That was the nature of the mountains. People came, people left, and the land kept its secrets. After a week, Marsh moved on. He continued his work, traveling deeper into the ridges, photographing families in places so isolated that some had not seen an outsider in years. But he kept the Talmadge photograph. He did not sell it, did not include it in the portfolio he occasionally showed to potential clients. He simply carried it with him, wrapped in oilcloth, stored in a wooden box alongside his other plates. And in his journal, he mentioned it only once more, in an entry dated November 3, 1867. "I cannot stop thinking about that shadow. It was not a trick of light. It was not an error in exposure. It was there, and I believe Mrs. Talmadge knew what it meant." 3 months later, Samuel Marsh disappeared. His wagon was found abandoned on a logging road near the Cumberland Gap, the darkroom tent still erected, the camera lying on its side in the mud. His journals, his money, and most of his glass plates were missing. Only a single crate remained, hidden beneath a tarp in the wagon bed. Inside were 73 photographs, including the portrait of Eleanor Talmadge and her children. The local authorities assumed Marsh had been robbed and killed, his body left somewhere in the wilderness where it would never be found. No investigation was launched. The wagon and its contents were seized by the county and stored in a courthouse basement where they remained untouched for 22 years. Until 1889. Until the Smithsonian received the crate. Until Daniel Cortlandt saw the shadow and asked the question no one had asked before. Who was standing behind Eleanor Talmadge when that photograph was taken? The answer, when it finally came, would require the Smithsonian to send investigators into the mountains to interview men and women who remembered the war, the hardship, and the things people did to survive when civilization looked the other way. It would require examining court records, church registries, and land deeds that told stories no one wanted to tell. And it would reveal that the shadow in the photograph was not supernatural. It was human. And that made it infinitely worse. Check if you're already subscribed to this channel, because what you're about to hear isn't folklore. It's documented history that most people never learned. And some truths are only preserved when someone is willing to listen. Daniel Cortlandt was not an adventurer. He was a bureaucrat, trained in cataloging, archival preservation, and the careful documentation of artifacts. But the photograph consumed him. He spent weeks in the Smithsonian's library, researching wet plate photography, studying the physics of light and shadow, consulting with engineers and chemists. Every expert gave the same conclusion: the shadow could not exist. But it did. And so, in July of 1889, Cortlandt boarded a train to Kentucky, carrying the glass plate wrapped in velvet, a notebook filled with questions, and the last known location of Eleanor Talmadge's cabin. The journey took 4 days, from Washington to Louisville, from Louisville to Harlan by rail, and from Harlan into the mountains by hired wagon. The driver, a man named Caleb Frost, had lived in the region his entire life. When Cortlandt showed him the photograph and explained what he was looking for, Frost studied the image for a long time before speaking. "That's the Talmadge place," he said. "Or what's left of it. Ain't nobody lived there in 20 years. You sure you want to go up there?" Cortlandt said he was sure. Frost shrugged. "Your funeral." They traveled for 2 days along roads that were little more than trails, climbing through forests of oak and hickory, passing cabins where children watched from doorways and dogs barked warnings. Frost spoke rarely, but when he did, he spoke about the land. He explained that after the war, the mountains had become a refuge for men who did not want to be found. Deserters, criminals, men fleeing debts or vendettas. "Law don't reach up here," Frost said, "and that's how most folks like it." On the second day, they reached the hollow where Eleanor Talmadge had lived. The cabin was still standing, though the roof had collapsed and the walls were green with moss. The creek ran clear beside it, just as Samuel Marsh had described. Cortlandt walked the perimeter, measuring distances, noting the position of the trees, trying to understand where the photographer would have stood when he took the picture. The angle of the sun, the placement of the shadows. Everything matched Marsh's description, except for the shadow that should not have been there. Frost watched from the wagon. "You planning to spend the night?" he asked. "No," Cortlandt said, "but I need to find people who knew her, who remember what happened here." Frost spat tobacco into the dirt. "That's going to be harder than you think. People around here don't talk much about the past, especially not about the Talmadges." "Why not?" "Because Eleanor Talmadge wasn't what you'd call a normal woman. And the things she did to keep her kids alive, well, let's just say folks would rather forget." Cortlandt pressed him for details, but Frost refused to elaborate. Instead, he directed Cortlandt to a cabin 5 miles north, where an old woman named Ida Carmichael lived with her daughter. "Ida was Eleanor's cousin," Frost said. "If anyone's going to talk, it'll be her, but don't expect her to make it easy." They reached the Carmichael cabin just before sunset. It was larger than Eleanor's had been, with a stone chimney and a covered porch where an elderly woman sat in a rocking chair, shelling peas into a tin bowl. She looked up as the wagon approached, her eyes sharp despite her age. Frost introduced Cortlandt, explained his business, and then retreated to the wagon, leaving the archivist to speak for himself. Cortlandt removed the photograph from its case and held it up. "Mrs. Carmichael, do you recognize this woman?" Ida studied the image for a long time. Her hand stopped moving. "Where'd you get that?" "It was found among the belongings of a photographer named Samuel Marsh. He disappeared in 1867, shortly after taking this picture. I'm trying to understand what happened to the woman in the photograph. Her name was Eleanor Talmadge. I believe she was your cousin." Ida set the bowl of peas on the porch and motioned for Cortlandt to sit. "You come a long way to ask about something that's been dead for 20 years. I came because there's something in this photograph that shouldn't be there. A shadow, behind her, and I need to know what it means." Ida looked at the photograph again, and for the first time, Cortlandt saw something flicker across her face. Not fear, but recognition. "You see it too, then," she said quietly. "See what?" "The man who was always there. The one she couldn't get rid of." Cortlandt leaned forward. "Who was he?" Ida sighed, long and slow, as if the weight of the story was something she had carried for decades and was only now allowed to set down. "His name was Virgil Talmadge, Eleanor's husband, the father of those children. And he didn't leave to work in the coal camps like she told people. He never left at all." She paused, letting the words settle, Then she continued. Virgil was a hard man, mean when he drank, and he drank often. During the war, he'd been a scout for the Union, tracking Confederate sympathizers through the mountains. He learned how to move without sound, how to watch people without being seen, how to survive on almost nothing. When the war ended, those skills didn't leave him. He came back to the Hollow, married Eleanor, and built that cabin by the creek. For a while, things were fine. But then the drinking started, and the anger. He'd disappear for days, hunting or trapping, and when he came back he'd be worse. Suspicious, violent, accusing Eleanor of things she hadn't done. She tried to leave once, took the children and walked to her sister's cabin 15 miles away. Virgil found her in 2 days, brought her back. After that, she stopped trying. Ida's voice grew quieter. In the spring of 1865, Virgil went hunting and didn't come back. 3 days passed, then a week. Eleanor assumed he'd finally left or gotten himself killed in the woods. She didn't mourn. She started living again, planted a garden, smiled at the children. For the first time in years, she wasn't afraid. But then, about a month after he disappeared, she started seeing him. Seeing him where? Cortland asked. Everywhere. Standing at the edge of the clearing, watching from the trees. She'd wake in the night and see his shape in the doorway, blocking the moonlight. The children saw him too, at least the boy did. He said his father stood by the creek at dawn, staring at the cabin but never coming closer. Eleanor tried to convince herself it was her imagination. Guilt, maybe, or fear. But then things started happening. Food would go missing from the cabin. Tools would be moved. One morning she found boot prints in the dirt outside the window, fresh from the night before. Someone was watching her. Someone who knew exactly how to stay hidden. Cortland felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. You're saying Virgil Talmadge was alive, that he was stalking his own family. I'm saying he never left, Ida said. He lived in the woods around that cabin for 2 years, built himself some kind of shelter up in the rocks where no one would find him. He watched Eleanor every day, watched the children. He never spoke to them, never approached, just watched, like he was waiting for something, or punishing her for being happy without him. Why didn't she leave? Why didn't she go to the authorities? Ida laughed bitterly. What authorities? The nearest lawman was 50 miles away, and even if he'd come, what could he do? Virgil hadn't broken any laws. He hadn't threatened anyone. He was just there, always there. And Eleanor knew that if she ran, he'd follow, so she stayed. And she lived with the knowledge that every time she stepped outside, every time she put the children to bed, he was somewhere close, watching. Cortland looked at the photograph again. The shadow on the cabin wall. Tall, distinct, positioned just out of frame. When this photograph was taken, he said slowly, Virgil was there, standing behind the cabin, just outside the lens. That's right, Ida said. Eleanor knew he was there. She always knew. That's why she looks the way she does in that picture. Not scared exactly, but tired. So tired. Because she knew he'd never leave. And she knew that one day he'd stop just watching. What happened to them? To Eleanor and the children? Ida's expression darkened. That's the part nobody likes to talk about. After the photographer left, things got worse. Virgil started coming closer, leaving things at the door. Dead animals, mostly. A rabbit with its throat cut. A crow with its wings broken. Eleanor knew what it meant. He was done watching, so she made a choice. The kind of choice no woman should ever have to make. She stood up, her joints creaking, and walked to the edge of the porch. 3 days after that photograph was taken, smoke was seen rising from the Talmadge cabin. By the time anyone got there, the place was burned to the ground. They found Eleanor's body inside, along with the children, all 3 of them. The fire had been set deliberately, from the inside, barred the door so no one could escape. Authorities ruled it murder, said someone had locked them in and set the fire, but they never found who did it. Virgil, Cortland said. That's what everyone assumed. But here's the thing. Virgil's body was found too. Not in the cabin. Up in the rocks, about half a mile away. He'd been dead for at least a week before the fire, maybe longer. Shot once in the chest. The rifle was lying beside him, still loaded. No witnesses, no evidence. Just a dead man in the woods and a burned cabin with 3 bodies inside. Cortland tried to process what he was hearing. Then who set the fire? Ida turned to look at him, her eyes cold and certain. Eleanor did. She killed Virgil and then she killed herself and her children, because she knew that even with him dead, she'd never be free. Because she'd lived with his shadow for so long that she couldn't remember what it felt like to live without it. And because she decided that dying together in a fire she controlled was better than living one more day in fear. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the insects seemed to have stopped their noise. The shadow in that photograph, Ida said quietly, isn't a ghost. It's the shadow of a man who turned himself into a ghost while he was still breathing. And it's the shadow of what he did to the woman he claimed to love. You wanted to know what it means? It means that some people don't need to die to haunt you. They just need to refuse to leave. Cortland returned to Washington in August of 1889, carrying Ida Carmichael's testimony and a growing collection of documents, land deeds, church records, and a coroner's report from 1867 that confirmed 3 bodies had been found in the remains of the Talmadge cabin. The fire had been ruled suspicious, but no charges were ever filed. The report mentioned a 4th body, found in the woods nearby, identified as Virgil Talmadge, dead from a gunshot wound of undetermined origin. The investigation had been closed within a week. Justice in that part of the world moved quickly, or not at all. But Cortland was not satisfied. Ida's story explained the shadow, explained the fear in Eleanor's face, but it did not explain how Samuel Marsh had known. Because Marsh had known. His journal entry from the night he developed the photograph made that clear. He had seen the shadow, recognized it as wrong, and planned to ask Eleanor about it. And then, the next morning, she had vanished. Or so Marsh believed. In truth, she had not vanished. She had made the most final choice a person can make. Cortland requested access to the remaining items from Marsh's wagon, anything that had not been included in the photographic archive. The Smithsonian's Acquisitions Department informed him that a second crate had arrived with the first, containing personal effects, clothing, a few books, and a leather satchel. The satchel had been logged but never opened. Cortland had it brought to his office. Inside, he found 3 items, a pocket watch, a tarnished silver locket, and a small notebook bound in oilcloth. The notebook was Samuel Marsh's private journal, separate from the professional log he kept of his photographic work. These entries were different, more personal, more raw. Marsh wrote about loneliness, about the isolation of traveling through the mountains, about the families he met, and the things he saw that troubled him. And on the pages dated October 1867, he wrote about Eleanor Talmadge in detail. Cortland read the entries by lamplight, long after the rest of the Smithsonian staff had gone home. Marsh's handwriting was small and precise, the letters crowded together as if paper were a scarce resource. October 14th, 1867. Photographed a woman and her children today. Eleanor Talmadge. A widow, or so she claims, though she wears no mourning. The cabin is well kept but small. The children are quiet, too quiet. They watch the tree line constantly, as if expecting something. I asked the boy, James, I think his name is, what he was looking for. He said, "My father." I asked where his father was. He pointed to the woods and said, "Out there. He's always out there." The girl said nothing, only held her mother's hand. Mrs. Talmadge did not correct the boy, did not explain. She only thanked me for coming and asked how long until the photograph would be ready. When I developed the plate tonight, I found the shadow. I have looked at it a dozen times, and each time I feel more certain. Someone was standing behind that cabin when I took the photograph. Someone tall, someone watching. Tomorrow I will ask her about it. I must know. It's October 15th, 1867. Returned to the Talmadge cabin this morning. The door was open. No one inside. The fire was still warm, breakfast half eaten on the table. I searched the clearing, called out, received no answer. The woods felt wrong, too silent, as if even the birds had fled. I noticed footprints in the mud near the creek. Large boots, man-sized, They led into the forest and did not return. I followed them for half a mile before losing the trail. When I came back, I thought I saw movement in the trees above the cabin, a shape, tall and still, watching me. I called out. No reply. I do not know what is happening here, but I feel certain Mrs. Talmadge is in danger. I have decided to ride to the nearest settlement and inform someone. It is an 8-mile journey, but I cannot leave this alone. October 16th, 1867. Spoke to the pastor at the settlement, Reverend Gaines. Told him about the Talmadges. He listened, said nothing for a long time, then asked if I had told anyone else. I said no. He advised me to leave it alone, said the Talmadges were a complicated situation and that outsiders did not understand the way families worked in these parts. I pressed him. He finally admitted that Virgil Talmadge, the husband, had not left for the coal camps. He was living in the woods, watching his family. Gaines said it had been going on for 2 years. Eleanor had come to him once, asking for help. He had prayed with her but offered nothing more. What could I do? He said. The man hasn't broken any laws, and if I confronted him, he'd only hurt her worse. I was sickened. I asked why no one had intervened. Gaines said, because this is the mountains, Mr. Marsh, and in the mountains, a man's family is his own business. I left his house feeling more helpless than I have ever felt in my life. October 17th, 1867. I cannot stop thinking about that photograph, about the shadow, about the boy's words. He's always out there. I have decided to return to the Talmadge cabin one more time. If she is there, I will offer to take her and the children to safety, somewhere beyond Virgil's reach. If she is gone, I will at least know I tried. The next entry was dated October 20th, 3 days later. October 20th, 1867. I went back. I should not have, but I did. The cabin was empty, as before. But this time I found something. A piece of cloth, torn, caught on a branch near the trail leading up into the rocks. It was from a child's dress. I recognized the fabric from the photograph. I followed the trail. It led to a cave, or rather a crude shelter built into a rock overhang. Inside, I found evidence that someone had been living there. A bedroll, tins of food, a rifle. And scratched into the rock wall, dozens of marks. Tally marks, I think, though I cannot say what they were counting. Days? Sightings? I do not know. What I do know is this. Virgil Talmadge was not just watching his family. He was documenting it, recording every day, every moment. It was not obsession. It was ritual. I left the shelter and returned to the cabin. That is when I saw him. A man standing at the far edge of the clearing. Tall, bearded, dressed in ragged clothes. He did not move, did not speak. He simply stood there, watching me the way he must have watched Eleanor for 2 years. I called out, asked if he was Virgil Talmadge. No answer. I took a step forward. He took a step back, disappearing into the trees like smoke. I did not follow. I rode away as fast as I could. I will not return. The final entry was dated October 23rd, 1867. October 23rd, 1867. I have learned what happened. A traveler brought news to the settlement this morning. The Talmadge cabin burned 3 nights ago. Eleanor and her children are dead. They say it was murder, but no one knows who did it. Virgil's body was found in the woods, shot. Some think Eleanor killed him and then took her own life. Others think someone else was involved, a stranger perhaps, or someone settling an old debt. I know the truth. I know because I saw him, because I saw the shadow, because I understand now that Virgil Talmadge was not a man anymore. He was something else, a presence, a weight, a thing that refused to let go even after death should have claimed him. Eleanor did not run because she knew running was useless. She killed him, and then she killed herself, because that was the only way to end it. I feel complicit. I took her photograph. I documented her suffering. And I did nothing to stop it. That was the last entry. The notebook contained 30 more blank pages. Cortland closed the journal and sat in the dark for a long time. He thought about Eleanor Talmadge, about the choice she had made, about the shadow in the photograph that was not supernatural but human, more human than most people could bear to acknowledge. He thought about Virgil, living in the woods, watching, counting, refusing to let his family go even as he destroyed them. And he thought about Samuel Marsh, who had seen all of this, recorded it, and then disappeared 3 months later under circumstances that were never explained. Cortland went back to the archives. He requested every document related to Marsh's disappearance, the sheriff's report, witness statements, anything. What he found was thin. The wagon had been discovered on November 9, 1867. No body, no sign of struggle. Most of Marsh's possessions were missing, suggesting robbery, but one detail stood out. The wagon had been found less than 10 miles from the Talmadge cabin. Marsh had been traveling in the wrong direction, not toward the next settlement, but back toward the hollow. Cortland reviewed the timeline. The Talmadge cabin burned on October 20th. Marsh's final journal entry was dated October 23rd. The wagon was found on November 9th. 17 days unaccounted for. What had Marsh been doing during those 17 days? And why had he returned to the place he swore he would never go back to? The answer came from an unexpected source. In December of 1889, Cortland received a letter from a man named Thomas Marsh, Samuel's younger brother, who had read about the Smithsonian's investigation in a newspaper. Thomas wrote that he had not seen his brother since 1867, but he had received one letter from him, dated November 2nd, 1867, 1 week before the wagon was found. Thomas had kept the letter all these years. He included a copy. The letter was brief. Thomas, if you receive this, know that I am not missing by accident. I have returned to the mountains because I must know what happened. I must see the cabin. I must understand whether Eleanor Talmadge found peace or whether her suffering continues even in death. I know this sounds like madness, but I have seen things here that defy rational explanation. Not ghosts, something worse. The persistence of cruelty, the refusal of violence to end even when its perpetrators are gone. I do not expect to return. If I do not, remember me as someone who tried to bear witness. That is all any of us can do. Samuel. Cortland sat with the letter for a long time. He understood now. Marsh had not been killed by bandits. He had gone back to the hollow, driven by guilt or curiosity or some compulsion he could not name. And whatever he found there, whether it was answers or only more questions, it had been enough to make him vanish. In the spring of 1890, Cortland published a brief article in the Smithsonian's Internal Journal describing the photograph and the story behind it. He did not include Ida Carmichael's testimony or Samuel Marsh's private writings. Instead, he framed the shadow as an unresolved optical anomaly, a curiosity of early photographic technology. The article generated little interest and was quickly forgotten, but Cortland kept the photograph. He kept the journals, and late at night, when the archive was empty and the only sound was the ticking of the clock on his desk, he would take out the glass plate and hold it up to the light, studying the shadow on the cabin wall, the tall, silent figure standing just out of frame, watching, waiting, refusing to leave even after everything had burned. If you've ever felt like someone was watching you, if you've ever looked over your shoulder and seen nothing but felt everything, leave a comment with the words, "He's always out there," because some presences don't need to be seen to be real. Daniel Cortland could not let it rest. The photograph haunted him, not because of what it showed, but because of what it represented. Proof that suffering could be documented, archived, and preserved long after the people who endured it were gone. He had written his article, filed his report, and returned the glass plate to its protective case. But every time he walked through the Smithsonian's halls, past the rows of specimens and artifacts and forgotten histories, he thought about Eleanor Talmadge and the shadow that had followed her to the grave. In the summer of 1890, Cortland requested a leave of absence. He told his supervisor he needed time to conduct independent research. What he did not say was that he was returning to Kentucky, to the hollow where the Talmadge cabin had stood, to search for Samuel Marsh's body. Because he had become convinced that Marsh was still there, buried in the woods, or lost in some cave, or lying at the bottom of a ravine where no one had thought to look. and Cortland believed that if he could find Marsh, he could find answers. Not just about what had happened to the photographer, but about what had happened to Eleanor. About whether she had found peace, or whether, as Marsh's final letter suggested, her suffering had continued even after death. Cortland traveled alone this time, no hired wagon, no guide. He took the train to Harlan and then walked, carrying a backpack with supplies, a tent, and a small journal where he recorded his observations. The land had not changed. The forests were still dense, the trails still narrow, the cabins still scattered across the ridges like gravestones. He reached the Talmadge Hollow on the third day. The cabin was gone. Nothing remained but a blackened patch of earth and a few stones from the foundation. The creek still ran clear beside it, indifferent to the tragedy that had occurred on its banks. Cortland set up camp 100 yards away, near a stand of birch trees where he could see the clearing but remain out of sight. He did not know what he was looking for exactly. Clues, perhaps. Evidence. Or simply a sense of the place, an understanding of what it had felt like to live here, to be watched here, to die here. For 3 days, he explored the area. He climbed to the rock overhang where Virgil Talmadge had built his shelter. The structure was gone, collapsed or scavenged, but the tally marks were still visible on the stone wall, hundreds of them, carved deep, each one a day of watching. Cortland counted them, 217 marks. 217 days that Virgil had spent in the woods, documenting his wife's existence from a distance, refusing to approach, refusing to leave. Cortland descended from the rocks and searched the forest for any sign of Marsh's passage. He found nothing. No discarded equipment, no remnants of a camp, no indication that the photographer had ever returned. He walked the trails, checked the creek beds, even examined the foundation of the cabin, sifting through the ash for anything that might have survived the fire. There was nothing. The land had swallowed the past and left no trace. On the 4th night, Cortland sat by his fire and wrote in his journal. He was beginning to feel foolish. He had come here looking for closure, for some final piece of evidence that would make sense of the tragedy. But the only thing he had learned was that some stories have no endings. They simply stop, and the people who are left behind must live with the silence. He was about to put out the fire and go to sleep when he heard a sound, a crack, sharp and deliberate, like a branch snapping underfoot. He froze, listening. The sound came again, closer this time. Cortland reached for the lantern beside his tent and held it up, casting a circle of light into the darkness. "Who's there?" he called. No answer. The forest was silent again, oppressively so. Cortland stood, his heart pounding, and took a step toward the trees. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said. "I'm just looking for information. About a man named Samuel Marsh. He disappeared here in 1867. If you know anything, please—" A figure stepped into the light. It was a man, old, with a long gray beard and clothes that looked like they had not been washed in years. He carried no weapon, but there was something about the way he stood, perfectly still, perfectly calm, that made Cortland's skin crawl. The man studied Cortland for a long moment, then spoke. "You're the one from Washington, the one asking about the photograph." Cortland nodded slowly. "You know about it?" "Everyone knows about it. Word travels, even up here. You think you're the first person to come looking?" "Who else came?" "The photographer. Marsh. He came back just like you. Camped right where you're standing now. Stayed for a week, searching. Then he left." "Left? He didn't die here?" The man shook his head. "No. He left. Walked out of the hollow and kept walking. But he wasn't the same. Something about this place, it changes you. He looked like a man who'd seen the bottom of the world and couldn't find his way back up." "Where did he go?" "West, into the Cumberland Gap. I heard later he made it as far as Tennessee. Died there, winter of '68. Pneumonia, they said. But I think it was something else. I think he just gave up." Cortland felt a wave of relief mixed with disappointment. Marsh had not been murdered. He had not disappeared into some unmarked grave. He had simply walked away, broken and exhausted, and died quietly in some distant town. It was not the dramatic ending Cortland had imagined, but it was human, and that made it worse. "Who are you?" Cortland asked. "Name's Boone. I've lived in these woods for 30 years. I knew the Talmadges, knew Virgil, knew what he was doing to Eleanor. I didn't stop it. None of us did. And we've had to live with that." "Why didn't you help her?" Boone's expression hardened. "Because Virgil was a dangerous man. Because anyone who got between him and Eleanor ended up hurt or dead. Because this is the mountains, and in the mountains, you survive by minding your own business. You want to judge us for that? Go ahead. But don't pretend you would have done any different." Cortland had no response. Boone was right. He would not have done any different. Few people would have. "Did Eleanor kill Virgil?" Cortland asked quietly. Boone was silent for a long time. Then he nodded. "She did. Shot him while he slept in his shelter. 1 bullet to the chest. She walked back to the cabin, barred the door, and set the fire. The children were already asleep. She made sure of that, put something in their supper so they wouldn't wake up. Then she lay down beside them and let the smoke take her. It was the only way she could see to end it, the only way to make sure he couldn't follow." "And the photograph? The shadow?" "That was Virgil. He was standing behind the cabin when Marsh took the picture. We all knew he was there. Eleanor knew. The children knew. But what could they do? If she'd acknowledged him, if she'd called out or tried to send him away, it would have made things worse. So she sat there, smiled for the camera, and pretended her husband wasn't 10 feet away, watching her like she was something he owned." Cortland felt sick. "And Marsh? Why did he come back?" "Same reason you did. He wanted to understand, wanted to make sense of it. But there's nothing to make sense of. Evil doesn't have a reason. It just is. Marsh figured that out eventually. That's why he left. That's why he didn't fight when the pneumonia came. He was tired. We're all tired." Boone turned to go, then stopped. "You found what you were looking for?" "I don't know," Cortland said honestly. "Then let me give you some advice. Stop looking. Some questions don't have answers. And some shadows don't fade, no matter how much light you shine on them. Eleanor Talmadge is dead. Virgil Talmadge is dead. Samuel Marsh is dead. The only person still suffering is you, because you won't let it go. Go home. Forget the photograph. Forget this place. It's the only way you'll find peace." Boone walked into the darkness and disappeared. Cortland stood alone by the fire, the weight of the old man's words settling over him like a shroud. The next morning, Cortland packed his tent and began the long walk back to Harlan. He did not look back at the clearing. He did not search for any more clues. He simply left. He returned to Washington in September of 1890. He resumed his work at the Smithsonian, cataloging artifacts, preserving histories, maintaining the careful order of the archive. He did not write about his trip to Kentucky. He did not speak of what Boone had told him. The photograph remained in its case, stored in a climate-controlled vault where it would be safe for another century. But sometimes, late at night, when the archive was empty and the silence was absolute, Cortland would think about Eleanor Talmadge, about the choice she had made, about the fire she had set, and the children she had put to sleep, and the shadow on the wall that had followed her every day for 2 years until she finally found the courage to make it stop. And he would wonder if Boone had been right. If some questions truly had no answers. If some suffering could never be redeemed, only remembered. And if the only thing worse than being haunted by the past was refusing to let it haunt you at all. The photograph of Eleanor Talmadge and her children remained in the Smithsonian's archives for another 43 years. During that time, it was examined by 3 separate historians, 2 photographic experts, and a psychologist studying the visual representation of trauma in early American portraiture. Each analysis reached the same conclusion. The shadow could not be explained by conventional means, but neither could it be proven supernatural. It was simply an anomaly, a trick of light, perhaps, or a flaw in the glass plate that coincidentally resembled a human figure. The reports were filed, The photograph was returned to storage, and the story of Eleanor Talmadge faded once again into obscurity. Daniel Cortlandt died in 1921 at the age of 64, never having spoken publicly about his investigation. His personal papers, including the journals of Samuel Marsh and the testimony of Ida Carmichael, were donated to the Smithsonian after his death. They were cataloged, archived, and forgotten. But in 1933, a young researcher named Margaret Hayes stumbled across the Talmadge photograph while conducting research on Appalachian settlement patterns. She was drawn to the image, not because of the shadow, which she barely noticed at first, but because of Eleanor's face. There was something in her expression, a kind of resigned exhaustion, that spoke to Hayes in a way few historical photographs did. She requested access to Cortlandt's papers, hoping to learn more about the woman in the image. What she found was the entire story: Marsh's journals, Ida's testimony, Boone's account, and Cortlandt's own notes from his investigation. Hayes spent 6 months verifying the details. She traveled to Kentucky, interviewed descendants of the families who had lived in the Hollow, and examined county records that Cortlandt had not been able to access in 1890. She confirmed that Eleanor Talmadge had died in a fire in 1867, along with her 2 children. She confirmed that Virgil Talmadge's body had been found nearby, dead from a gunshot wound. She confirmed that Samuel Marsh had disappeared shortly after photographing the family, and that his body had later been buried in a churchyard in Tennessee. But Hayes also uncovered something new. In the Harlan County Courthouse, she found a deposition that had been filed in 1868, a year after Eleanor's death. It was testimony from a woman named Sarah Hicks, who had lived 2 miles from the Talmadge cabin. Hicks stated that in the weeks before Eleanor died, she had visited her and asked for help. Not help escaping Virgil, help killing him. Hicks had refused, horrified by the request. But Eleanor had been calm, almost businesslike. She said she had tried everything else. She had prayed. She had reasoned. She had begged. Nothing had worked. Virgil would not leave. He would not confront her. He would not grant her a divorce or a separation. He would only watch. And Eleanor had come to understand that the watching was the cruelty. The distance was the violence. She could endure being beaten. She could endure being threatened. But she could not endure being seen every day by someone who refused to acknowledge her as human. So she had decided to kill him. And then, because she knew that killing him would not be enough, that his shadow would remain, that his presence would linger in her mind and in the minds of her children, she had decided to kill herself and the children as well. It was not an act of despair. It was an act of logic. The only way to truly escape a man who had turned watching into a weapon was to remove herself from his sight forever. Hicks's testimony had never been used in any investigation. It had simply been filed and forgotten. Hayes included it in her report, which she submitted to the Smithsonian in the spring of 1934. The report was published in an academic journal and generated modest interest among historians of domestic violence and frontier justice. The photograph was exhibited briefly in 1935 as part of a larger collection on early American photography. A few visitors noticed the shadow. Most did not. And then the photograph disappeared. It was not stolen. It was not lost. It was simply misfiled during a reorganization of the Smithsonian's photographic archives in 1947. The glass plate was placed in the wrong storage box, and the accompanying documentation, Cortlandt's notes, Marsh's journals, Hayes's report, were scattered across 3 different collections. For 50 years, the photograph existed in bureaucratic limbo, cataloged but inaccessible, known but unseen. It was rediscovered in 1998 during a digitization project aimed at preserving the Smithsonian's most fragile photographic materials. A technician scanning glass plates from the 19th century noticed the shadow and flagged the image for further review. The photograph was re-examined, the documentation was reassembled, and the story of Eleanor Talmadge was told once more, this time on the internet, where it reached an audience far larger than any academic journal ever could. The image went viral. Paranormal enthusiasts claimed it was proof of ghosts. Skeptics argued it was a hoax. Domestic violence advocates used it as a symbol of the invisible suffering endured by women in abusive relationships. Artists created tributes. Filmmakers proposed documentaries. For a brief moment, Eleanor Talmadge became famous, not for what she had endured, but for the shadow that had documented it. And then, like everything on the internet, the attention faded. The photograph was shared less frequently. The debates moved on to other mysteries. Eleanor Talmadge returned to the archive where she had always been. But the photograph remains. It can still be viewed today in the Smithsonian's online collection. The shadow is still there, tall and distinct, standing just behind the woman who tried so hard to escape it. And if you look closely, if you study Eleanor's face, the way her hands rest in her lap, the way her children lean against her as if seeking protection, you can see what Daniel Cortlandt saw, what Margaret Hayes saw, what anyone who looks long enough will eventually see, that the shadow was never the horror. The horror was the fact that Eleanor had to live with it, day after day, year after year, until the only choice left was to set fire to everything she loved and step into the flames. In 2003, a historical preservation group in Kentucky announced plans to restore the Talmadge Hollow. They intended to mark the site where the cabin had stood, install an informational plaque, and create a short hiking trail for visitors interested in Appalachian history. The project was funded by a small grant and supported by local historians who believed the story deserved to be remembered. But when they approached the descendants of the families who had lived in the area, including the descendants of Ida Carmichael and Sarah Hicks, they encountered resistance. The families did not want the site commemorated. They did not want tourists walking through the hollow, taking photographs, treating Eleanor's suffering as a curiosity. They argued that some stories are not meant to be public, that some tragedies should remain private, and that Eleanor Talmadge had endured enough exposure, first from Samuel Marsh's camera, then from Daniel Cortlandt's investigation, then from Margaret Hayes' research, and finally from the internet. She wanted to disappear, one descendant wrote in a letter to the preservation group. The least we can do is let her. The project was quietly abandoned. The hollow remains unmarked, accessible only to those who know where to look. The creek still runs clear. The trees have grown tall over the place where the cabin stood. And if you visit, if you walk the trail that Eleanor once walked, carrying water from the creek, watching the tree line for movement, living in fear that never announced itself but never left, you will find nothing. No plaque, no monument, no indication that anything of importance ever happened there. But the photograph exists, and that perhaps is monument enough. Because the shadow in that photograph is not just Virgil Talmadge, it is every partner who used surveillance as control, every spouse who refused to grant freedom, every person who weaponized presence and turned love into a prison. The shadow is the stalker who follows but never attacks, the abuser who watches but never strikes, the predator who knows that the threat of violence is often more effective than violence itself. Eleanor Talmadge understood this. She understood that Virgil did not need to touch her to destroy her. He only needed to be there. Always there. A shadow on the wall. A shape in the trees. A presence that would not end. And so she ended it. Not because she was weak, but because she was strong enough to make the one choice Virgil could not control. She took back her agency in the only way the world had left her. And whether that choice was justice or tragedy, whether it was freedom or despair, is a question that each person who sees the photograph must answer for themselves. Daniel Cortlandt believed it was both. In the final entry of his private journal, written shortly before his death, he wrote, "I have spent 30 years thinking about Eleanor Talmadge. I have examined every piece of evidence, interviewed every witness, walked every trail, and I have come to understand that there is no redemption in her story, no lesson, no moral clarity. There is only the fact that she suffered, and the fact that she chose to stop suffering, and the fact that we, who were not there, who did not live under that shadow, have no right to judge her for it. The photograph remains because truth remains. And truth, unlike justice, requires no justification. It simply is." Margaret Hayes came to a different conclusion. In her 1934 report, she wrote, "The photograph of Eleanor Talmadge is not evidence of the supernatural. It is evidence of the failure of civilization. It documents a moment in which a woman, trapped by geography, poverty, and the legal structures of her time had no recourse but violence. And it reminds us that such moments continue to occur, not in the mountains of the 19th century, but in the suburbs, cities, and homes of the present. The shadow has not disappeared. It has only learned to hide better. Both were right, and both were incomplete. Because the photograph is not just a document of suffering or a critique of society, it is also a portrait of a woman who existed, who lived, who made choices under conditions so constrained that calling them choices feels obscene, and who, despite everything, tried. She tried to protect her children. She tried to survive. And when survival became indistinguishable from torture, she tried to end it in a way that would grant her some measure of control. The photograph does not tell us whether she succeeded. It only shows us the moment before the end, a woman, 2 children, and a shadow that would not leave. It asks us to bear witness, and it asks us implicitly what we would have done in her place. Most of us will never have to answer that question. Most of us will never live under a shadow so persistent, so inescapable, that death seems like the only door left unlocked. But some will, and for them, Eleanor Talmadge's story is not history. It is mirror, and the shadow on the wall is not Virgil's. It is their own. In 2019, the Smithsonian launched a digital exhibition on domestic violence in 19th century America. The exhibition included the Talmadge photograph, along with court records, medical reports, and testimonies from women who had survived abusive relationships. The curators framed Eleanor's story not as an anomaly, but as a pattern. One example among thousands of women who lived and died in the margins of history, their suffering documented only when it produced evidence dramatic enough to be preserved. The exhibition received significant attention. Advocacy groups praised it for centering women's voices. Historians debated whether Eleanor should be classified as a victim, a murderer, or both. And survivors of domestic violence looked at the photograph and saw themselves. Not in Eleanor necessarily, but in the act of being seen, of having their suffering documented, of existing in the historical record not as statistics or abstractions, but as people whose pain was real, whose choices were impossible, and whose stories mattered. The exhibition closed in 2020, but the photograph remains online, accessible to anyone with an internet connection. It has been viewed millions of times. It has been shared, analyzed, and reinterpreted by people across the world. And in that sense, Eleanor Talmadge is no longer invisible. She is no longer trapped in the hollow, watching the tree line, waiting for the shadow to move. She is everywhere. Her story is everywhere. And the question she poses, how do you escape a person who refuses to let you go, is everywhere too. There is no good answer. There is only the photograph, and the shadow, and the knowledge that some suffering is so profound, so totalizing, that even burning it to the ground leaves traces in the ash. If you've watched this far, it's because this story meant something to you. Maybe you saw yourself in Eleanor. Maybe you saw someone you knew. Maybe you simply understood that some truths are too important to forget. Leave a comment saying, "I've watched this far," so I can get to know you and see who really engages with the stories here on the channel. Your presence matters. Your witness matters. And if this story moved you, share it. Not because it's entertaining, but because it's true. And truth, no matter how dark, deserves to be remembered. Subscribe to this channel if you believe that history is not just dates and names, but people, real people who lived, suffered, and made choices that still echo today. Hit the like button if you think Eleanor Talmadge's story should be taught in schools, discussed in homes, and remembered by a society that too often forgets the cost of silence. And share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Because the shadow on the wall is still there. It's always there. And the only way to make it visible is to keep looking. Eleanor Talmadge died in 1867. But her photograph lives on, and as long as it does, so does the question she left behind. How many people are living under shadows right now? How many are watching the tree line, waiting for the shape in the woods to move? How many are choosing every day to survive one more day, even when survival feels impossible? We will never know their names. We will never see their photographs. But they are there, and they are watching. Just as Eleanor watched, just as Virgil watched, just as we, looking at this photograph across a century and a half, are watching now. The shadow remains, the story remains, and the question remains: what will you do with it?